single gunshot shattered the silence of the Arizona desert. It wasn't the sound of a soldier's warning or a hunter's aim. It came from somewhere unexpected, distant, hollow, like a final breath exhaled by the land itself. The echo rolled across the canyon walls and vanished into the dusk, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. Somewhere in that silence, something had changed. Something had begun. The desert was, as it had always been, merciless. Dry winds whipped across the scrub and sandstone, scouring the land bare. In the distance, jagged peaks tore at the fading light, and shadows grew long across the red earth. Coyotes waited for night. Buzzards circled high and lazy. And beneath it all, time moved like the slow erosion of a riverbank patient, inevitable. On the edge of this unforgiving world stood the ranch of Elias McGraw, 52 years old, once a Union soldier. Elias had long ago turned his back on the smoke and politics of the East. The Civil War had left him with scars deeper than flesh, and in the years that followed, he had watched more of life slip through his fingers than he cared to admit. His wife, Maria, gone to smallpox in the winter of '68. His son, taken by fever before his second birthday. Since then, Elias had chosen silence, hard work, and the company of the land over the company of men. His ranch was built on solitude, 800 acres of stubborn soil, cattle fencing, and prayers whispered only when the stars came out. That evening, as the sky bled into violet and gold, Elias rode the western perimeter of his land. It was routine. He checked fence lines, watched for coyote tracks, made sure the creek hadn't dried to a trickle. But as he rounded a cluster of mesquite trees near the old watering hole, he saw something that froze his breath mid-chest. There, sprawled in the brittle dust like a discarded doll, lay a young woman. She was motionless, her limbs twisted oddly, her long black hair matted with sweat and blood. A length of broken chain still clung to one ankle, and her skin bore bruises that spoke of harsh restraint. But it was her face still, serene and sun-scorched, that held him, and the necklace at her throata, carved silver wolf head, tarnished but unmistakably Apache. Elias dismounted slowly, every movement deliberate. His instinct screamed to walk away. This wasn't his fight. He had no quarrel with Apaches, no intention of inviting trouble from tribes or soldiers. He had survived this long by minding his own business. But then the moonlight shifted, catching the necklace just so, and for a flickering second he saw Marionette as she had died, but as she had once been, smiling, fierce, alive. He clenched his jaw. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. She was still breathing barely, shallow, weak, but there. Carefully, Elias crouched beside her. Her hands were blistered, her lips cracked from thirst, and a faint cut beneath one eye was still oozing. She had run from someone or something, and whatever it was, it had meant to break her. By Tren. He didn't know who she was. Didn't know what storm might follow if he took her in, but something in the tilt of her chin, even unconscious, spoke of will unbroken. And Elias McGraw, for all his distance from the world, still knew the look of someone who had not yet surrendered. He wrapped his duster around her slight frame, lifted her into his arms with a grunt, and laid her gently across the saddle. The horse nickered but did not shy. The wind hissed through the mesquite like a whispered warning. As he mounted and turned back toward the ranch, Elias glanced once more at the horizon behind them. The sky had gone dark, but the feeling in his chest told him dawn had just begun. He didn't yet know that this one act, this foolish, human act, would unravel the silence he had built his life upon. The ride back to the ranch was slow, careful. Elias cradled the girl's body against his chest, one arm steadying her while the other guided the reins. Her breathing was shallow but steady, her head resting near the silver cross pinned to the inside of his kawada, small relic of his wife, worn thin with years but never removed. The desert night grew colder with each passing mile, but he felt her warmth seep through the fabric. It was the first human closeness he'd known in years. Not a word passed his lips. He rode in silence, but his mind was loud. What was he doing? This girl, Apache, injured, marked by chain, and flight was trouble. Even if she wasn't pursued, she came with questions Elias couldn't afford to answer. The army at Fort Bowie was always watching, always suspicious. If she was a runaway from some reservation or military transport, harboring her could mean prison. Worse, it could invite war. But leaving her to die would have been another kind of death, one he couldn't bear to carry. By the time he reached the ranch, the moon had crested high, bathing the homestead in cold silver light. The log house stood firm against the dark his own hands had built it, each beam a testament to solitude and stubbornness. The barn creaked in the wind. A lantern flickered behind the window pane. Inside, Elias moved like a soldier efficient, quiet. He laid the girl gently on the spare bed in the corner room, a space long unused. Then he stoked the fire, fetched clean water, and brought down a tin of dried sage and willow bark things Maria had once used for fevers and burns. He worked without speaking, washing the grime from the girl's face, bandaging the cut beneath her eye. When he rolled up her sleeves, he found bruises rings of dark blue and violet around her wrists. He swallowed hard. Chains. Recent. Before he touched her again, he paused. Slowly, he unbuckled the Colt revolver from his hip and placed it on the far table. Then the knife laid carefully beside it. These weren't gestures of cowardice. They were his way of telling her, if she woke, that this house was not another prison. He left a basin of water by her bedside and draped a blanket over her shoulders. For a long while, he stood there, just watching her. The fire crackled. Wind brushed against the shuttered windows like a spirit searching for entry. In the distance, a coyote yelped, high and lonely. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He knelt beside the bed, not because he expected miracles, but because Maria had always prayed in moments like these, and something in his soul remembered. He folded his hands, rough and scarred, and whispered, "Lord, if this girl is a burden I'm meant to bear, grant me the strength. If she's danger, give me the courage to face it. And if she's deliverance in disguise, then help me not to run from it." He rose slowly, his knees aching from age and labor, and walked to the hearth. Before he could sit, something caught his eye, a glint of metal, just beneath the edge of the girl's tunic. He crouched and gently pulled it free. It was a flute, bone-carved, etched with markings he recognized as Apache. Beautiful, old, but it wasn't the instrument itself that made his throat tighten. It was the black eagle feather tied to it, a symbol of mourning or of vengeance. The desert didn't offer many second chances, not for men like Elias. And yet, standing there in his own home, staring down at the still form of a stranger who had somehow already shaken loose the dust from his soul, he knew this wasn't random. This was a beginning. But beginnings come with echoes of old ghosts, old sins, and debts not yet paid. And he knew, somewhere beyond the silent hills, someone was already following the trail they'd left behind. CTA. The girl didn't stir through the night. Elias sat in the old rocking chair across the room, his rifle leaned silently against the wall. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting flickers of amber light across the pine floor. Outside, the wind shifted, whistling through the eaves like a memory trying to find its way home. Inside, time slowed to a crawl. He had stripped the girl's torn dress only enough to clean and bind the worst of her wounds. Beneath the layers of grime and bruising, her body told a story of running, of captivity, and of fierce resistance. There were welts on her shoulders, defensive cuts on her arms. Someone had tried to break her spirit, but even unconscious, Elias could see they had failed. He hadn't asked for this. His life was simple, by choice. He rose with the sun, tended the cattle, mended fences, hunted what meat he needed, and spoke only when necessary. The world beyond his land had become little more than a whisper. He hadn't crossed the county line in months. Fort Bowie was 2 days' ride. Tombstone, 3, and the Apache camps, those were always shifting, always uncertain. The last thing he needed was to invite the attention of soldiers or scouts. But there she was, a child of the desert, a stranger, a story written in pain and silence. At some point in the night, he stood and pulled a chair closer to her bedside. He checked the cloths, replacing them with fresh water, smoothing her hair away from her forehead with rough fingers. Her skin was hot, fever had found her. He muttered under his breath, then turned to the cupboard for what little he had left of Maria's medicine kit. Willow bark, powdered yarrow, and a touch of honey. It wasn't much, but it was what he had. He coaxed a bit of it between her lips, careful not to choke her. Her throat moved as she swallowed just once, but it was enough. He sat back and exhaled. From the mantel, Maria's Bible looked down at him-worn leather, the edges softened by her hands. It hadn't been opened in years. Elias hadn't had the heart to touch it since the day he buried her, wrapped in the same blanket now draped over the Apache girl. He looked at the sleeping figure and felt something stir, something like duty, but not just that. What kind of world would send a child like her into the desert alone, in chains? What kind of men would lay hands on someone so small and strong and utterly defenseless? He didn't have answers. But he knew one thing for certain. If she survived the night, he wouldn't let her be taken again. His eyes grew heavy with the hours. The fire cracked softly, sending up sparks like silent prayers. Elias leaned forward, elbows on his knees, watching her chest rise and fall. And then, in a moment so soft it barely registered, the girl moved. Her hand twitched under the blanket. Her fingers curled slightly, then stilled. Elias straightened. He said nothing, did nothing, just watched. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled again, long and lonesome. The stars blinked overhead like old gods keeping their distance. And Elias McGraw, who had buried a son and forgotten how to pray, kept his vigil through the night beside a girl with a wolf around her neck and fire in her blood. It was just after dawn when she stirred again. Elias had drifted into a light doze in the chair, his boots stretched toward the fireplace, his hat tipped forward. But the sudden shift of fabric, the soft rustle of movement, pulled him upright in an instant. The girl was awake. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, scanning the ceiling, then the room, then him. Doc. Shop. Untrusting. She didn't speak, but every muscle in her body tensed as if ready to spring, though she had neither the strength nor the footing. Her eyes darted toward the corner, where the rifle stood, then to the door, then back to him. "I ain't gonna hurt you," Elias said quietly, voice like gravel rubbed between fingers. He didn't move from the chair. "You're safe here." No answer. The silence between them was taut as wire. Elias held his breath, letting her absorb the space, the fire, the bandages, the folded blanket, Her gaze settled on the tin cup beside the bed. With effort, she tried to reach for it. Her arm trembled, failed halfway. Elias stood slowly, palms open. "Let me," he said, and stepped forward only when she didn't protest. He lifted her slightly, propped a pillow behind her back, and held the cup to her lips. She drank cautiously, never taking her eyes off his, the way a wild creature drinks when cornered. When the cup was empty, he set it down and stepped back again. "You've been out for a day," he said. "High fever. I gave you bark and water. It's helped some." Still, she said nothing, but her expression shifted not to gratitude, but to calculation. She was measuring him, judging him, not just by his words, but by the way his hands moved, the way he stood, the distance he kept. He respected that. "What's your name?" he asked. A pause, then, hoarse and faint, "Nah, Lecha." It came out like breath, barely louder than the fire's crackle. "Apache?" She didn't nod. She didn't have to. "I'm Elias McGraw," he said. "This is my land, my home. You were lying near the old watering hole, chained and half dead. I figured you'd rather be inside than buzzard feed." She flinched slightly at the mention of chains. Elias said nothing more. Instead, he moved back to the fireplace, stoked the embers with the iron poker, and added a log. The flames revived slowly, like reluctant memories. He poured himself coffee and stood near the window, letting the quiet settle again. Behind him, the girl's breathing had slowed, not to sleep, but to steadiness. Minutes passed. Then she spoke soft, deliberate. "You take my weapons?" Elias turned, one brow raised. "Didn't see any weapons, just a flute and some tokens in your pouch. You want those back? They're on the shelf." Her eyes flicked toward the mantel. Relief flickered in them, faint, but real. "Why help me?" she asked after a while. The question hung in the room like smoke. Elias sipped his coffee, staring out the window at the horizon. The sun was coming up over the ridge, gold light spilling across the brush. "Didn't feel right to leave you," he said simply. That was all. Na Lecha said nothing more, but the silence now felt less like suspicion, and more like a space being cautiously shared. Like a narrow bridge had begun to form fragile, but real between two people who'd spent too long trusting no one. Later that morning, while Na Lecha slept again, Elias found himself standing in the doorway of the storage room that had once been Maria's garden closet. It was odd, the way memories worked. One moment he was watching the girl fight fever with clenched fists in her sleep, and the next he was standing among old terracotta pots, half-used seed sacks, and a cracked watering can, his hands brushing dust from shelves untouched for years. Maria had loved this corner of the house. Even in the driest of seasons, she'd coaxed herbs to grow in small wooden troughs by the windows. She'd taught him to boil willow bark for pain, how to make tea from desert mint, how to use aloe for burns. She used to say, "The land gives, but only if you ask gently." Na Lecha reminded him of that of someone who knew how to ask the land gently and survive even when it refused. On the top shelf sat an old tin box, its lid rusted at the corners. Elias hesitated, then lifted it down and set it on the table. Inside were the remnants of another life. A faded handkerchief, once white, embroidered with a tiny blue cross at the corner. A dried piece of lavender, still fragrant after all these years. A ribbon. A folded letter yellowing, and soft at the creases. Elias touched each item with the reverence of a man handling relics. Maria's handwriting stared up at him from the letter, strong and even. It was a prayer she'd copied from her Bible during her last week's quiet offering, never spoken aloud, tucked away instead like a message for a future that never came. He closed the box. Back in the main room, Naleka stirred again, this time with less panic, more weariness. Elias brought her warm broth and helped her sit. She drank slowly, with measured sips. He sat on the edge of the table, arms crossed, watching. "You look like her," he said suddenly, surprising himself. Nalecha looked up, confused. "My wife," he clarified. "Maria. She was Mexican, from Sonora. Not Apache, but there's something. The eyes, the way you don't flinch when things get hard." Naleka didn't answer, but her gaze softened, just slightly. "She died," Elias continued, not sure why he was speaking at all. "Winter of '68. Smallpox swept through the territory. Took her fast. Too fast." He exhaled. There was a hitch in it, though the years had passed like dust blown across the porch. "I buried her under the mesquite tree out back, the one that blooms yellow in spring. She liked to sit there and watch the rabbits." Naleka looked away, toward the window. "My son, too," Elias added after a pause. "Only lived a year and a half. Fever. Buried him beside her." Silence settled again, not awkward, but full of something deeper. Elias wasn't a man who spoke of grief, but with this girl in his home, stitched by silence and survival like himself, the memories had found their way to the surface. Nalecha turned back toward him. Her voice was quiet. "I'm sorry." Elias nodded once. "Thank you." That was all they said. But when Elias stood to leave the room, Lecha's hand reached out not to stop him, but to brush the edge of the blanket covering her legs. The same blanket Maria had died under. Her fingers lingered on the fabric, then fell away. And Elias understood. It wasn't just her wounds that needed healing. It was something older. In both of them, the days that followed unfolded like a dream stitched with silence. Naleka spoke little, and Elias asked even less. There was no need for words. When caution hung in the air like desert heat-dense, invisible, and ever-present. But something in the quiet between them shifted. Not trust, not yet, but understanding. An unspoken treaty formed not in speech but in action. Each morning, Elias prepared a fire and set water to boil. He made coffee for himself and steeped sage for Naleka. She drank slowly, still weak, her movements deliberate. He watched from his usual chair, always a respectful distance away, but never far enough to feel absent. She watched him, too. When she was strong enough to sit on her own, she asked to see her things. He brought the leather pouch and laid it on her lap without a word. She unwrapped each item carefully: stone amulet carved with a sunburst, a scrap of deerskin painted with red ochre, the bone-carved flute tied with a black feather. Each one was touched, turned over, held close, then returned to the pouch as though they were people she'd been separated from. He didn't ask about them. She didn't offer. In the evenings, Elias would step outside, take to the porch with a pipe and a blanket. The wind came up from the canyons at dusk, dry and sighing. Sometimes Naleka sat by the fire and watched the flames move. Sometimes she stayed in the shadowed corners of the room, eyes half-lidded but always alert. It wasn't until the fourth night that something changed. He was on the porch as usual, pipe in hand, boots propped on the rail. The moon hung low and gold. The cattle had settled. Somewhere far off, an owl called. And then music, soft, thin, like wind through bones. He turned his head toward the sound. Nalecha stood in the doorway, her flute at her lips. She played without looking at him, her eyes distant, as if reading something only she could see. The melody rose like smoke wavering, mournful but not broken. It wound its way through the air and into Elias's chest, stirring places long dormant. It was the sound of things lost, of prayer without words, of voices speaking through wood and breath. He didn't move. When the song ended, she lowered the flute and leaned against the doorframe, silent. "That's a lonesome tune," Elias said finally. Naleka gave the faintest shrug. "It's not meant to be." He looked at her, really looked. The firelight caught her face, highlighting the bruise at her temple, the tired curve of her mouth, but also something more in inner steadiness, like a tree weathered by wind but still rooted. "It sounds like mourning," he said. Her voice came quiet, firm. "It's remembering." They sat in silence again. He returned to his pipe. She stepped back inside. The door closed behind her with a soft click, but the echo of her music lingered, settling into the grain of the porch boards, the timbers of the house, and somewhere deep inside the man who had long ago forgotten what it meant to share a quiet with someone who wasn't trying to fill it. The next morning, Elias found Naleka outside. She stood near the corral, the desert wind teasing her loose hair as she faced the rising sun. A blanket was draped over her shoulders, the same one she had been wrapped in since her arrival, and her bare feet pressed lightly into the cold morning dust. The flute was in her hands again, dangling from a leather thong at her wrist, swaying gently as she moved. Elias didn't call out. He simply watched from the porch, mug of coffee warming his fingers. The way she stood still, poised, with her eyes half closed, reminded him of Maria again. Not in features or form, but in the way she seemed to belong to the land, to understand it as something more than dirt and sky, to revere it. Naleka lifted the flute to her lips and played a few low, tentative notes, nothing like the melody of the night before. This tune was different, sharper, shorter, like a message or a memory broken into pieces. After a moment, she stopped and turned. "You were watching," she said plainly. Elias stepped down from the porch and walked toward her, stopping a few feet away. He nodded. "Didn't mean to pry." Naleka tilted her head, studying him. "You don't ask questions." He sipped his coffee. "You don't offer answers." She considered that, then slowly unwrapped the flute from her wrist. Holding it gently in both hands, she extended it toward him. He hesitated, then took it, surprised by how light it felt. The bone was smooth and worn, etched with careful symbols, lines like sun rays. A jagged mountain range, a small spiral near the mouthpiece, and tied to its end, a single black eagle feather, long and graceful, swaying in the breeze. "It was my brother's," she said. "He carved it when we were children, before the raids, before the soldiers came." Elias looked up from the flute, his gaze steady. "What happened?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached up and gently took the flute back, holding it against her chest like a talisman. "He was taken," she said finally, "by men who wore the flag but had no honor. I was told he died in a camp in New Mexico, but I don't know. I never saw him again." Elias felt a weight settle in his chest. He thought of graves, marked and unmarked, of faces fading from memory, of sons lost in the fog of war. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. Naleka looked down at the feather. Her fingers traced its shaft. "Black feather means mourning in my people, but also vigilance. It means you watch the sky even when the ground betrays you." Elias looked to the horizon, the pale line where earth met heaven. "Seems fitting." She glanced at him, then returned her gaze to the flute. "I kept it because it reminds me who I am, and because I promised I'd never forget his song." For a long moment, they stood in silence. Then Elias reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small silver cross, no larger than a thumb. He held it in his palm, open, unoffered. "My wife carried this until the day she died," he said quietly. "She believed it wasn't just a symbol, but a presence, a way to remember something bigger than pain. Naleka looked at the cross, then at him. "We both carry things," she said. Elias nodded. "And we don't put them down easy." They stood there, side by side, not speaking further, the flute between them, the cross between them, and somewhere in the rising sun, two old songs very different, and yet not at odds, began to hum the first notes of harmony. Later that afternoon, Elias was splitting firewood when he heard the door creak open behind him. Footsteps, soft but certain, crossed the porch. He paused mid-swing and turned. Nalecha stood there, wrapped in a shawl that had once belonged to Maria. Her eyes were no longer sunken from fever, though the shadows beneath them still lingered. She was holding a small tin cup, steam rising from my hand. The flute hung once more from her wrist, like a silent companion. "I made tea," she said, "the kind you left on the shelf." Elias set down the axe and brushed wood chips from his sleeves. "Appreciate it." She handed him the cup, then sat on the porch bench, legs tucked under, watching him with a quiet that didn't feel like distance anymore, just presence. For a while, neither spoke. Elias sipped. The tea was bitter but comforting, with the earthy aftertaste of sage and something floral he couldn't name. "I know you wonder," Nalecha said at last. Elias didn't look at her. "What makes you think that? You watch me the way animals watch a creek in drought, careful, as if it might dry up or be poisoned." He gave a faint huff of air, half chuckle, half truth. "I suppose I do. I don't blame you," she added. "You have no reason to trust me." Elias sat down beside her, though not too close. "Neither of us have much reason to trust anyone." She nodded slowly. Then, after a pause, "I was promised to a man I didn't choose. Lobo Verde, a warrior from the southern band. Strong, respected, dangerous." Elias didn't interrupt. "He sees women as vessels, for heirs, for alliances, for pride," she said, her voice even but tight. "Not as minds or spirits. My uncle, he wanted to keep peace between the bands. He thought giving me would buy it." "Geronimo?" Elias asked quietly. "Nah." Lecha's gaze turned sharp. "You know his name?" Elias nodded. "I fought in the war. Later, I worked the border trails. I've heard of him. Some call him a rebel, others a prophet." She tilted her head. "He's both, and neither. Like most men worth remembering." There was a long pause. "I ran the night before the binding ceremony," she continued. "My aunt helped me. She gave me coin, food, a mule. But Lobo's men were already watching. They caught me by the dry riverbed. I broke a man's nose before they chained me." Her jaw tightened. "They wanted to take me back, show the others what happens to girls who shame their family." Elias looked at the bruises on her wrist, the raw skin, the way she clutched her shawl knot for warmth, but armor. "You escaped." She looked at him then, steady, defiant. "No," she said. "I endured, until I could escape." Elias nodded. Respect, unspoken, passed between them. "I don't need saving," she said after a moment. "If that's what you think." "I didn't think that," Elias replied. "You already did the hardest part. I just happened to be on the trail when the Lord nudged me off my saddle and said, 'This one still has fight in her.'" Naleka blinked. "You think God sent you?" Elias shrugged. "I think he doesn't make mistakes." She considered that, then said softly, "My people don't speak his name, but we believe in signs and in rivers that cross when they're meant to." A gust of wind stirred the dust. The sun dipped low, painting gold across the porch rails. Two voices, two worlds, and for the first time they spoke without armor. The wind shifted that night. It came in colder than usual, sweeping down from the mountains in gusts that carried the scent of pine smoke and something darker something Elias couldn't name, but had learned long ago to trust. He stood at the edge of the porch, lantern in one hand, eyes scanning the far hills. Behind him, the house was quiet. Nalecha had gone to sleep early, worn from the retelling of her escape, but Elias couldn't rest. The kind of quiet blanketing the desert wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. He stepped off the porch and walked the perimeter of the corral, boots crunching softly over packed earth. The horses were restless, nothing visible, but they stirred more than usual. One whinnied low and kicked the stall wall. Elias ran a hand down its neck, whispering comfort. Then he saw it, near the western fence line, pressed into the dust, barely visible in the lantern's glow hoofprints. Not from his horse, not fresh, but recent enough. He crouched low, fingers brushing the indentations. More than one set, no signs of wagons, no shoes on the hooves. Indian ponies, most likely, moving light and fast. Elias stood slowly, a knot forming in his chest. Someone had come close, and whoever it was, they hadn't wanted to be seen. Back inside, he bolted the door and checked the windows. Then he walked to the mantel and pulled down his rifle, checking the chamber, the oil, the action. He laid it beside the door. The Colt followed, tucked into his belt. He hadn't needed to arm himself this heavily in years, but the signs were there. He thought of Lobo Verde, of the broken chain around Leka's ankle, of the bruises that had faded but hadn't disappeared, and of the eagle feather. That symbol had meant something to him before, a vague sense of mourning or honor, but tonight it struck him differently. He remembered stories from border scouts about certain Apache war parties marked with black feathers. They rode not for conquest, but for correction, for punishment, to reclaim what they believed was stolen. He walked to Lecha's door, and paused, then knocked once. "Come in," her voice said, soft but awake. She sat up in bed, the shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes alert even through exhaustion. Elias stepped inside. "There's been riders near the fence," he said without ceremony. "Light-hoofed, Apache, maybe scouts." She didn't flinch, didn't gasp, just nodded once. "He'll come," she said. "He doesn't accept no." Elias crossed his arms. "I figured as much." "You should turn me over," she added. "Tell them you found me, nursed me, but had no choice." He raised an eyebrow. "That's something you want me to do?" "No," she said, "but it's the easiest way to survive." He stepped closer, the fire behind him, throwing his shadow across the room. "I've done easy before," he said. "Didn't like what it made of me." They locked eyes. "Then we prepare," she said simply. Elias nodded. "We prepare." Outside, the wind howled across the desert floor, scattering dust into the night. Somewhere beyond the ridgeline, a shape moved too fast for a wild thing, too quiet for a friend. And beneath that vast sky, the storm Nalecha had run from began to find its way back to her. CTA, when the past begins to knock louder than memory, even the quietest place must learn to raise its voice or be swallowed whole. The tracks weren't the only sign. By the next morning, the birds had fallen quiet. The wind, which usually skated across the dry grass with song and motion, hung still. The sky bore no clouds, yet something heavy pressed down on the land as if it knew what was coming. Elias saddled his horse before first light, moving with the quiet urgency of a man who'd learned long ago not to trust calm before storms. Nalecha stood on the porch watching him, arms crossed beneath her shawl, her hair braided now, tight and practical. "You're riding west," she said, more a statement than a question. He nodded. Just checking the line. Won't be long. But they both knew that wasn't true. The ride to the western boundary took less than an hour. The land there sloped toward the hill's perfect cover for scouts. Elias dismounted near a cluster of mesquites and crouched low to the ground. Fresh tracks, this time clearer. 3 horses, light-footed, Apache style, no doubt now. They were watching. Back at the ranch, he unsaddled quickly and began reinforcing the fences, not because he thought it would stop anyone, but because habit gave his hands purpose. He checked the barn, stashed extra tools and supplies, loaded cartridges with meticulous care. Naleka worked beside him without being asked. She'd gathered sage and tobacco, crushed them in a bowl, and mixed them with ashes. When he asked what it was for, she answered simply, "A warning, burned on the wind. It tells spirits where not to tread." Elias didn't argue. These days, he figured both their gods were listening. He added 2 sticks of dynamite to the barn's trapdoor, a relic from old mining stores he'd once used to clear boulders. They might serve a new purpose now. That afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Naleka stood barefoot at the edge of the clearing, eyes scanning the distant ridges. She seemed impossibly still, like she belonged to the stone and dust. "They're close," she said. Elias didn't doubt her. He could feel it, too, like breath on the back of his neck. That night, neither of them slept. They kept the lanterns low and their weapons within reach. The fire crackled low, but the air stayed cold. Elias sat at the table, cleaning his rifle. Nalecha carved something into a scrap of bark shapes he didn't recognize. It was well past midnight when the sound came. Hooves. Not many, maybe 2 or 3, circling the outer edge of the clearing. Elias moved to the window, careful not to shift the curtain too far. Nothing visible, but he didn't need to see them. They were sending a message. "We know you're here, and we're coming." He turned to Naleka. Her face was expressionless, but her hands had stilled. The flute lay beside her on the table, untouched. "We have time," she said quietly. Elias nodded. But time, he knew, was no ally. Not out here. Not when the shadows began to move like men with purpose. And somewhere, out beyond the ridges, Lobo Verde was closing in. The fire had burned low by morning. Elias tossed in a pine log and watched the sparks leap upward before he turned to Naleka, who sat cross-legged on the floor beside the hearth. She was sharpening a slender blade with quiet concentration, known of the few things he hadn't realized she'd carried in her pouch. The blade was old, well used, and polished to a dull shine. Not military issue, not decorative. It had seen its share of blood. "Tell me about him," Elias said finally. Lecha didn't stop sharpening. "Lobo Verde?" He nodded. The name had hung between them since her arrival, but they'd never spoken it plainly. "He wasn't always like this," she said after a moment. "When we were children, he was quiet, clever. But war changes men. And power," she hesitated, her voice catching like a thorn in dry brush. "Power poisons them." Elias sat back in his chair, hands clasped over his stomach. "Was he ever your kin?" "No," she said. "But he wanted to be." She looked up then, eyes steady. "After my brother was taken, Lobo tried to fill the space, brought my uncle gifts, led raids, made himself useful. He told stories of glory, of returning to the old ways." She paused. "But it was all for control. He wanted the title, not the truth. And when my uncle refused to name him as heir, he turned his sights to me." "Because you're blood to Geronimo," Elias said. Naleka nodded. "A binding with me would have meant influence, legitimacy. And for some in the tribe, those who want to fight, to reclaim by force, she's become a symbol. But not for you." "No," she said. My uncle believes in our people surviving, not just winning. He sent me to Fort Bowie to learn the white man's words, to learn how to speak peace as well as war. Elias raised an eyebrow. That's where the missionary woman comes in. Margaret Thompson, Naleka said, her tone softer now. She taught me to read, to write. She gave me the first book I ever owned, a small Bible. Elias glanced at the shelf where Maria's Bible still sat. A strange symmetry, that two women of different blood and language had found similar faiths in different deserts. She risked much helping me escape. Nah, Lecha continued. And Lobo knows it. He hates her for it. Hates me more. So this isn't just about you, Elias said, his voice low. No, she replied. It's about what I represent. If he takes me back, broken, chain at it sends a message. Submission is the only future. But if I stay free, she didn't finish, she didn't have to. Elias leaned forward. Does he know where we are? He will, she said. The flute, the pouch, I left a trail. Not because I wanted to, but because I didn't have time to cover it. He'll come, not with armies, but with enough. Elias nodded slowly. We'll be ready, he said. Nah. Lecha's fingers closed around the knife. We'll be more than ready. And in the flickering firelight, two people once strangers from worlds never meant to meet sat, not as victims, but as a promise, a stand against what they would not surrender to. Not fear, not hatred, and not Lobo Verde. It was Na Lecha who brought it out. After breakfast, she opened her pouch carefully, fingers brushing past the flute and talismans until she drew out a folded piece of paper creased at the corners, stained by sweat and dust. She offered it to Elias, without a word. He unfolded it gently. The handwriting was neat, feminine, pressed hard enough to leave faint impressions on the back. To whomever finds this letter, Na Lecha is no prisoner. She is a witness, a bridge, and perhaps a beginning. I have taught her not because she is mine to teach, but because she chose to learn. Her knowledge is not a betrayal of her people, it is a gift to them and to any who still believe peace is possible. If she comes to you, protect her. Not because she is weak, but because what she carries is worth protecting. Margaret Thompson, Fort Bovia Mission School. Elias read the words twice, his fingers trembling ever so slightly. Na Leka stood by the window, arms folded, eyes on the horizon. She wrote it the day I left, she said. She knew Lobo might come for me, she said. Truth needs witnesses, and sometimes strangers must carry it forward. Elias folded the letter again, slower this time. I remember Fort Bowie, he said. I rode escort for a supply train there. The officers were half drunk, the chaplain was angry, and the land around it felt like it wanted to spit the fort out. Nalecha gave a faint smile. Margaret used to say that building a mission in the middle of fear is planting flowers in stone. He placed the letter on the mantel, beside Maria's Bible. She sounds like someone my wife would have liked. I think they would have understood each other. Nah, Lecha replied. Both soft, spoken, both stronger than the men around them. There was silence after that, but it wasn't empty. It was reverent, like the hush inside a chapel before someone lights the first candle. Elias walked outside, boots crunching over the hard-packed dirt. He stared at the hillsdree, jagged and old. They had seen blood. They had heard prayers. Now they would hear something else. He turned to find Na Lecha behind him. Do you believe what she wrote? She asked. Elias looked at her. The sun caught the copper threads in her hair. The shadow of her past still clung to her posture, but there was fire in her gaze now steady and unafraid. I don't know about peace, he said slowly, But I believe in truth, and I believe in people who carry it with both hands. Naleka said nothing, but her shoulders relaxed, just slightly. Then Elias added, almost as an afterthought, "And if the Lord led you here with that letter tucked against your heart, I'd be a fool to ignore it." They stood together in the doorway as the wind stirred the dust around their boots. Behind them, the letter rested between Bible and rifle, like a covenant waiting to be tested. And soon, it would be. They came at dusk. Elias spotted them first silhouettes at the far ridge, etched black against the dying sun. At first, it was just one rider, then three, then a dozen. They didn't rush, didn't call out, just watched. Naleka stepped out beside him, already gripping her bow. "It's him." Elias didn't ask how she knew. He saw it in her face, in the way her lips tightened and her jaw set like flint. By the time night fell, the strangers had moved closer, setting camp just outside rifle range, circling the ranch like wolves, scenting blood. No torches, no campfire, just silence and the cold gleam of eyes reflecting moonlight. Elias and Leka didn't sleep. They took turns watching. Leka on the roof, her figure hunched like a sentinel crow. Elias below, loading cartridges, checking the traps he'd set around the property, reinforcing doors and windows with extra planks. The night was windless, but every board creaked as if groaning in warning. "They're waiting," Elias said as the second dawn rose. Nalecha nodded. "He wants us afraid." Well, he picked the wrong house. Still, there was no denying the pressure. The well was 2/3 full. The food stores would last maybe 2 weeks. Ammunition was limited. Elias had enough for a fight, but not a siege. At noon, Lobo Ferda rode forward. He stopped a dozen yards from the gate, sitting tall on a paint horse, his war paint smeared in green and ash. Young, broad-shouldered, eyes like obsidian knives. He didn't shout. He spoke in a low, deliberate voice that carried across the distance. "Old man," he called, "you harbor something that belongs to me." Elias stepped out onto the porch, rifle across his arms, but not raised. "She doesn't belong to anyone." Lobo smiled not kindly. "She is Apache. She is promise. She is mine." "Ugh, no," Naleka said, emerging behind Elias, her voice hard and unflinching. "I am myself." Lobo's smile twitched. "You shows shame, Nalecha. You defy our law, our way. Our way is not fear. Our way is not chains." He shifted in the saddle. "Then I will take what I am owed, and the man who shields you will watch the land burn beneath his feet." Elias stepped forward, just one pace. "Then come." Lobo didn't move, didn't speak. He simply turned and rode back toward the camp. The others followed, slow and silent. By sunset, smoke rose from their fires. Signals, threats, maybe both. Inside the cabin, Elias set a fresh log on the hearth and sat across from Nalecha. "We'll hold them," he said, his voice rough. Naleka looked up from her work fashioning arrowheads from old nails and shards of bone. "Even if they come at night?" "Yes." "Even if it costs us everything?" "Yes." She nodded, then looked into the flames. "Then we pray not for deliverance, but for courage." Elias didn't answer aloud, but he reached for Maria's Bible, opened it to the only psalm he'd ever memorized during the war, and began reading quietly. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," outside, the wolves circled. Inside, the fire burned steady. They struck before dawn. Not Lobo Vertebu, Elias and Nalecha. While the night still clung to the hills and the desert air hung cold and thin, Elias opened the hidden trapdoor beneath the floorboards of the barn. Inside lay rusted traps, lengths of wire, even a few claymore-like devices he'd fashioned long ago out of tin, powder, and patience. Things he'd buried with the part of himself that once walked muddy fields in blue. "Last time I touched these," he muttered, "I was younger, dumber, and thought glory had a name." Naleka stood beside him, stringing her bow. "And now? Now I just want to live long enough to regret it." Before the first ray of sun touched the horizon, they were moving setting snares at likely paths of approach, scattering shards of glass near blind spots, creating a network of noisemakers with wire and tin cups along the fence. Nalecha dug shallow trenches with her knife at choke points, covering them with brush. Elias reset the hunting blind overlooking the rear corral, lining it with extra cartridges and jerky. They didn't speak much. They moved with the wordless rhythm of two people whose survival depended on each other's silence and speed. By mid-morning, Elias leaned against the porch post, wiping his brow. His face was drawn but resolute. "If I were them, I'd strike tonight," he said. Nalecha nodded. "They're testing our fear." Elias chuckled. "They're gonna be real disappointed." Then she handed him something, an old tin plate. On it, she'd drawn a crude but precise map of the surrounding land, with arrows, lines, and marks indicating likely flanking positions. She'd even noted wind patterns and natural echo points. "I watched them last night," she explained. "They posted a scout on the North Ridge, but they don't know the dry wash behind the goat pen runs under the fence line." Elias looked at her, then at the plate, then back again. "Remind me never to play poker with you." Naleka didn't smile, but the corners of her mouth twitched. "I don't bluff." That night, they waited. Elias sat in the old rocking chair, shotgun across his knees, watching the horizon through half-lidded eyes. Nalecha perched on the roof, bow ready, her silhouette small against the sky. They spoke little, but their breaths were steady, grounded. Near midnight, the silence broke, just a whisper of movement, then a snap of twine. A tin cup clattered. Elias rose in one smooth motion, whispering a prayer under his breath. "Lord, you are my refuge, and my fortress, me God, in whom I trust." The traps were springing now. A muffled curse, a yell, the sound of hooves kicking up dust. Elias took his shot from the shadow of the barn, the muzzle flash blooming like a spark of judgment. Nalecha let loose 2 arrows zone hit wood. The other found its mark with a sickening thud. The night erupted, but it was their ground, their plan, their fight, and for now they were winning. The fighting did not last long. Lobo Verde's men, ambushed by traps and met with unexpected resistance, fell back before the sky even paled with dawn. Cries echoed as they retreated into the darkness, leaving behind wounded Pretty and one rider limping from a pierced thigh. Elias stood at the edge of the porch, rifle still in hand, his breath rising in the cool air. His eyes scanned the horizon. Nalecha joined him, her face unreadable. "He'll come back," she said quietly. "He will," Elias replied. "But not tonight." They hadn't won. Not yet, but they'd held just enough. By noon, a strange quiet settled over the land. No birdsong, no wind, just the long hush of something approaching. Elias heard it first, the distant thunder of hooves, not in panic, but rhythm-measured and heavy, a procession. From the east, across the ridgeline, came a group of riders. Not many perhaps, 7 or 8, but their presence was thunderous. At the center rode an older man draped in a blanket of deep reds and ochre, a feathered headband resting above sharp eyes that burned like coals. His presence felt older than the rocks beneath their boots. "Nah," Lecha's breath caught. It's him. Elias didn't need to ask. Geronimo dismounted before the porch, his warriors forming a semicircle behind him. His gaze moved from Elias to Na Lachand, lingered there. "You are not dead," he said in Apache, his voice low and firm. "Not yet," Na Lecha replied. He looked at Elias next. "And you are the man who shelters my blood." Elias met his stare. "She saved herself. I just kept the door open." Geronimo didn't smile, but there was something in his expression that softened just slightly. "We heard the whispers," he said, "of a girl who fled chains, of a hunter who hunts without honor, and of a white man who fights like one who has lost much but still believes in something." He stepped closer. "Lobo Verde is not my doing. He was once a boy with eyes like stars. Now he is a man with fire behind them, and no wind to cool the blaze." Na Lecha stepped forward. "He seeks to take back what I never gave, to claim honor through fear. That is not our way." Geronimo nodded solemnly. "Number it is not." There was a long silence. Then the chief turned to his warriors. "Tonight we make our camp near the riverbed. Tomorrow I will speak to Lobo Verde. If he listens, there will be no blood. If not, we will answer him with the truth of our people." He turned once more to Elias. "You have a quiet strength. You carry grief like a shadow, but you did not let it blind you. My daughter chose well." Elias blinked. "Daughter." Geronimo's mouth twitched. "By blood, she is my brother's child, but by heart she is mine. And you, Elias McGraw, are no longer just a stranger on stolen land." Then he remounted and rode away, leaving dust and a strange peace behind. Na Lecha stood quietly beside Elias. For the first time since her arrival, her posture eased not in defeat, but in belonging. "They will listen to him," she said. Elias nodded, his voice low. "Let's hope it's not too late." CTA. Morning came with a hush that felt sacred. The campfires of Lobo Verde had turned to ash. His warriors, what remained of them, had vanished like ghosts at sunrise. The only sounds now were the wind brushing through mesquite trees and the low murmur of cattle stirring in the corral. Elias sat on the porch, cup of coffee warming his weathered hands. His body ached in ways both familiar and new, but it wasn't the pain that occupied his mind. It was the silence, not of defeat but of something that had passed through them and left them changed. Na Lecha emerged from the cabin wrapped in Elias's old wool coat. Her eyes were sharper now, but gentler too. She moved with the confidence of someone who had not just survived, but been seen. "They're gone," she said softly. "For now," Elias replied. She sat beside him, not close enough to touch, but close enough to share warmth. Geronimo left before sunrise. He said the land would know soon what path Lobo chooses. Elias gave a dry chuckle. Man like that doesn't need to shout to be heard. They drank in silence. After a while, Na Lecha stood and retrieved something from her satchel, a bundle wrapped in deerskin. She handed it to Elias. Inside was the scarf Maria had once embroidered, now restored, but along its faded edges, Na Lecha had stitched new pattern symbols from her tribe. Mountains, stars, the coiled serpent of healing. "I thought she might like it," Na Lecha said, her voice steady. Elias held the cloth as if it were a living thing. The ache in his chest deepened, but so did something else: gratitude. Not for what he had lost, but for what he had been allowed to remember without bitterness. "She would have liked you," he said. "She believed God sent people in seasons like rain or wind, sometimes to test, sometimes to heal." Na Lecha met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Do you believe that?" Elias looked out across the desert where the sunlight painted the rocks gold. "I'm starting to." They did not speak of love note yet. The words would come in time. For now, it was enough to sit beside one another, sharing the silence of survival and the quiet promise of something more. The days that followed were filled not with tension, but with tending. Elias repaired the barn roof, the planks splintered during the siege. Naaleka helped mend fences, her hands quick and precise. The rhythm of ranch life returned, though it now carried a different timberless isolation, more communion. On the third morning, a rider approached. He came not with a threat, but with a letter sealed with wax, bearing the insignia of Fort Bowie. Elias broke it open slowly, scanning the careful handwriting. It was from Margaret Thompson. She was safe. Her transfer to the San Carlos mission had been delayed, but she had received word somehow of Lecha's fate, and the stand Elias had taken. The letter thanked him not in formalities, but in the language of deep, quiet faith. In protecting her, you've not only defended a life, but a truth that still flickers like a candle in the wind. God sees you, Elias McGraw. Even now, he folded the letter carefully and passed it to Lecha. She read it slowly, her lips moving with each line, her brows furrowing with every sentence. When she finished, she pressed the paper to her chest, eyes glistening. She gave me the words to name my freedom. Nah, Lecha whispered. But it was you who gave me the ground to walk it. Elias looked at her for a long moment, then turned his gaze to the horizon. It wasn't mercy, he said. It was recognition. I saw myself in you. I still do. That night, the stars came out early. Lecha sat cross-legged in the yard, shaping clay into small figure seagulls, deer, even a coyote with a tilted head. Elias watched from the porch, a Bible resting open on his lap. He hadn't read it in years, not truly. But now, the words called to him again. He has sent me to bind up the broken-hearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners. He closed the book gently. Maybe that's what Maria had meant. That God's work didn't always roar through thunder or blaze from burning bushes. Sometimes it walked on calloused feet, sat in silence beside sorrow, and waited patiently for the moment when two souls dared to reach beyond pain toward something sacred. Spring rolled over the Arizona desert like a quiet hymn-soft rains, washing the dust from the yucca leaves, wildflowers blooming in the most unlikely places. Life, once threatened, now whispered gently through every breath of wind. Lecha stood at the edge of the porch, her eyes searching the skyline. Not with fear anymore, but with a longing for something only the open land could answer. Elias joined her, his hat in hand, the scarf she'd mended now tied loosely around his wrist. A symbol not just of Maria, but of something new, something chosen. You ever think, he said quietly, that maybe we didn't survive just to go on livin'? Lecha turned toward him. No, she said. I think we survived so we could start living right. They sat together as the sun melted into gold behind the buttes, silence stretching long and wide between them. In that silence lived all the things they didn't yet have words for: grief, love, respect, hope, a trust forged not by promises, but by presence. I'm not yours, Lecha said after a long pause. I know, Elias replied, and I ain't yours. But maybe, just maybe, we belong to something bigger than both of us. She nodded slowly. To the land, to the truth, Elias added, to the story we're writin' every step we take together. They didn't speak of marriage. Not yet. But when Lecha reached out and rested her hand on his, Elias didn't flinch. He simply closed his fingers gently over hers, like a man who had learned the cost of holding on too tight and the miracle of being held with grace. As night fell, Nalecha lifted her flute to her lips. The first notes rose like prayer soft, reverent, echoing the heartbeat of the desert itself. In the distance, a single church bell from Fort Bowie rang faintly, carried on the wind. Two worlds, two songs finding harmony. And so their story joined the long, quiet legends of the frontier, not of gunfighters or gold rushes, but of healing, hope, and the kind of love that mends not just wounds, but whole histories. This is one of those true Wild West stories, not just about survival, but about redemption. About two hearts learning that freedom isn't just the absence of chains, but the presence of someone who sees you as you truly are. If it touched something in you, some old ache or buried hope, didn't let it fade. Share it. Remember it. Let it ride with you into the silence of your own sunsets.